Okay, this is the first part of Chapter 2. When I first sat down to record this, I recorded a long, whole hour long, the entire chapter, and then I thought, boy, this is going to be excruciating for the students to listen to. It was actually excruciating for me to do. So I decided, hey, let's do it different. Let's actually do it in chunks. Just like the module is laid out, there are different pages with different content. I'm going to do just a short little lecture for each one of those. So this is Chapter 2, the physical and electrical properties of the cells in the nervous system. So we're going to start out talking about neurons, since those are our favorite nervous system cells. Neurons, they receive information, they process it, they generate output. They are just like any other cells in our body. They have organelles like the nucleus and Golgi bodies, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, etc. In the soma, the body of the neuron, the nucleus and the Golgi apparatus and the rough ER are doing their job. They're translating DNA into proteins and producing neurotransmitters and all the other things that the cell needs to run. The other organelles, like the mitochondria and lysosomes and everything, are distributed throughout the neuron, so they can be very far away from the nucleus. Just like every other cell in our body, it's surrounded by a plasma membrane. It separates the extracellular environment from its contents. When we start talking about its electrical properties, we will see how important this is, because we have to be able to keep certain charged ions out and certain ones in to maintain that electrical differential from the inside and the outside of the cell. So I'm going to start talking, I'm going to look at a picture of a neuron now. And here we go. So this is the, in the module, the content pages. So we have here what is basically our standard neuron. It's multipolar, meaning it has a lot of different branches going out from it. When we draw like our generic neuron, one that's not a specific place, this is kind of where we start when we're drawing it. So I would like you to know all the terminology associated with the neuron, and there's a list of the terms that I want you to know right here. So the soma is the cell body, and that's just like any other cell. It contains the nucleus and the Golgi apparatus and the rough ER where it's producing proteins. Dendrites are sort of like the branches of the trees. They are a receiving station for the cells. That's where your input is coming into the neuron through those dendrites. The axon is a specialized projection, and it's the output unit of the cell. So it's sending impulses out, sending neurotransmitters out to other cells, to the target cells. There's a sort of a pointy part on the soma that's called the axon hillock. It's the region of the cell where the axon sprouts. So when you have an undifferentiated stem cell, when it starts to differentiate into a neuron, it forms that axon hillock, and the axon sprouts and it grows out and finds another cell to synapse with. So in the development of the nervous system chapter, there are actually some neat videos of electron micrographs showing that axon hillock sprouting, which is kind of cool. So the terminal end of the axon is called the presynaptic terminal. An axon can branch out and have several different presynaptic terminals, but that is the transmitting element of the neuron. That's where the neurotransmitters are released, and they go out to do what they're supposed to do. So the synapse, it contains the pre and the postsynaptic terminals. The presynaptic terminal is on the first neuron, the postsynaptic terminal is on the second neuron, and the space between the two of them is called the synaptic cleft. And that's where the information gets transferred by neurotransmitters. So the postsynaptic terminal is the receiving end of an interneuronal communication, and it's on the second neuron in the chain. Neurotransmitters, those are our information chemicals that are released from those presynaptic terminals. So There are some videos that you can watch. Some of them are quite short, like the 2-minute one, and it describes what I just described. There's another one that's much more detailed right after that. Your choice whether you want to watch them or not. I kind of like animated things, so it's nice to watch them. The 4 basic functions of neurons are reception, so they're receiving input from other cells. Integration, they process that input, decide what they're going to do with it. Transmitting it along the axon across the synapse, and transferring that output to another neuron or a muscle cell or gland. So that's really basically all those 4 things is all that neurons do, and they make everything happen in our body, so it's pretty amazing. So there's another video that discusses the terminology that we just discussed. It's just a different way to look at the information, and you can decide what you like best. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here, and all of these figures are straight out of the book. So if they're kind of small in here and you can't see them very well, you can decide to look in the book and look a little more closely at them. In this figure, which is right out of the book, figure 2.1, it shows a close-up in the top right of a synapse. It has the presynaptic axon, the synaptic cleft, and the postsynaptic membrane, and the little neurotransmitter getting released there. So it just kind of shows that close-up, and we'll look at that more closely in chapter 3 as well. So all of the components that we talked about are listed in the PowerPoint, which of course you can download, and the basic functions of the neuron, those are things you should know. There are several different types of neurons. They have a standard set of components. The organization of the neuron itself depends on the type of neuron that's involved. So usually they are separated into 2 separate categories: bipolar cells and multipolar cells. So bipolar cell, the classic example is the retinal bipolar cell in the eye. It has 1 dendrite and 1 axon. So just two poles going, either one input, one output. The multipolar cell, that's sort of the one that we've already looked at. The classic example is the spinal motor neuron. It projects from the spinal cord to innervate several skeletal muscle fibers at once. It has a lot of projections coming off of it. So they're classified by how many structures arise from the cell body. Okay? So with bipolar neurons, there are 2 primary structures: the dendritic root, which divides into multiple branches, and the axon, which projects to form the presynaptic terminals. There's this subclass of bipolar cells. They're called pseudo-unipolar cells. They appear only to have a single projection that divides into 2 axonal roots, so it kind of has 2 axons and no 2 dendrites. It's a special kind of cell, and we'll look at pictures of all these in a minute. With multipolar neurons, multiple dendrites arise from many regions of the cell body and a single axon. So that's like the one that we already looked at. It's the tree. The branches are the dendrites. They are the most common cells in the vertebrate nervous system, and there are a variety of shapes and organizations. They receive tons of information, tons of input, and all that information is then processed by the neuron and possibly transmitted to other cells. So the little fun fact here: typical spinal motor cell receives approximately 8,000 synapses on its dendrites and 2,000 synapses on the body itself. So we'll talk about different types of synapses. So a lot of times we'll say the axodendritic synapse, so that's between an axon and a dendrite. That's those 8,000 synapses on a spinal motor cell. There's the axosomatic synapse, which is an axon synapsing on the cell body itself. And then there's the axo-axonic synapse. So an axon is synapsing directly with another axon, and those can have inhibitory or excitatory effects depending on what's going on in that particular synapse at that particular time, and we will talk about that more later as well. So looking at the pictures of the different types of neurons, so this one is the one on the far left, this is figure 2.4 in the book, is the bipolar. It has one dendrite with a bunch of branches and one axon with a bunch of branches, basically, primarily. You can see there's some little other ones there, but it has those two primary processes extending from the cell body. So the retina of the eye is the classic example of where you find those bipolar neurons. Letter B here, the second one from the left, is the pseudo-unipolar. And it's sort of two axons projecting from the cell body and no true dendrites. Sensory neurons that are transmitting information to the cell body, you get that central axon conducting information from the cell body to the spinal cord. So it's, even though it pretty much kind of looks a lot like the other ones, the fact that they're both axons and there really are no true dendrites, that's the main difference. But of course there are going to be other axons synapsing all over this thing and then causing the information to go out in different directions. So C is the multipolar single axon with multiple dendrites. They receive tons of synaptic input from really large numbers of synapses. The spinal motor neuron is that classic example. Purkinje cells in the cerebellum, they have way more because they're trying to process all the information that's coming in our body and integrate it into balance and movement. So C is that classical spinal motor neuron. D is that Purkinje cell in the cerebellum. That thing's huge with 1 million dendrites, tons of input. And then E is showing an interneuron in the central nervous system, which you can see is also a multipolar neuron. So in this picture, it's interesting to note that even though they're all shown right next to each other and they all kind of look like they're the same size, they are not shown to scale, and so we can have neurons in our body that are huge and ones that are very, very tiny. So like, for example, the sciatic nerve contains nerve roots as part of one neuron that go all the way from L5 to S2 all the way down to your big toe, a single neuron. There are a bunch of them lined up in the nerve, but that is a very large nerve cell. In contrast, in the cerebellum you can have, or in the cerebellum and the cerebrum, you can have interneurons which are just super tiny, and they're processing information between different neurons and connecting up networks of neurons in those little nuclei. So it's crazy the different morphology that you get with all these different neurons. Cool stuff, I'm telling you. Okay, so we're going to wrap that up, just talking about neuron structures and neuron morphology. And in the next part of the chapter, we will be talking about some of the things that go on inside the neuron. So thanks for listening. I hope this wasn't too long or too boring.